I'm Monique Sharp, and this is Get Sharp, where I'm lucky enough to chat with people just like you on turning fear into focus and leveling up their lives. Today, Michael Coles shares his experience and what it's like to live with autism. Michael openly shares his personal journey from initial diagnosis, navigating fatherhood, to finding his voice and falling in love with who he is. Not only has Michael overcome some challenging experiences, but now he's helping others to do the same. Listen in to find out more. Michael, thank you so much for giving me your time today. It's lovely to speak to you.
Good to speak to you, Monique. It's finally good to be part of the Get Sharp podcast.
I'm really keen to hear a little bit more about your experience with autism, and thank you for being courageous to speak about that and how that has impacted your life, but also it sounds like it's made it a little bit better in some instances because you're more aware. Would you like to start by sharing with me what autism means to you?
I was diagnosed with a condition called PDD-NOS when I was 3 years old, and this was back in 1978. I was re-diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome back in 2010. This is when I was 35, and then re-diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder back in 2017. I think sort of like back even like 15 years ago, I was not courageous to actually sort of get some treatment, mainly because of the stigma associated with being autistic. I didn't sort of also sort of like, resonate with people quite a fair bit at the time, but I think as like, knowledge gets better now and also sort of acceptance gets better now and accessibility gets better now, I think more people are actually sort of coming out and they can sort of like say, oh, I've got the same experience as you. And basically it's great to sort of also connect to those people. I think sort of like connecting with other neurodivergent people has been fantastic to actually sort of like, they can just get it. A lot of people sort of like, before they got diagnosed with autism, they can be like depressed or, basically have complex PTSD situations. So
when you were diagnosed, what did they explain autism to be to you? And how did they say that that may affect your experience?
previously there was a lot of stigma around autism and Asperger's and stuff like that back at this place because you're not quite autistic because you're basically high functioning, but you sort of like you can be sort of a little bit monotone, you can be sort of like serious, or you can have sort of like weird facial expressions or something like that, or you can do like things that are sort of like be sort of considered quite quirky and quite weird. So I mean, I kind of like who I am.
I'd love to hear from your perspective what characteristics you feel you have of autism and how that might be different to what people would expect.
Well, I'm just basically sort of like quirky and stuff like that. I didn't sort of like have sort of like relationships until like my mid-30s or my early 30s, I should say. I didn't sort of like, have many friends and stuff like that back in sort of like, when I was a teenager or in primary school because sometimes I just wanted to be on my own and stuff like that. If I was overstimulated, I needed to go to sort of some quiet place like a library and stuff like that. I was fairly depressed back at that particular time, and I was just trying to sort of like, just relate to people, and then sort of like, they didn't get me, and then I struggled to communicate, and sometimes I communicate in a different way, that type of thing. So I tend to sort of like, basically sort of like, communicate in hand gestures, or if I sort of take longer to sort of like, communicate in sort of some sort of way, then it may not make sense to other people. So I've also got diagnosed with expressive language disorder and receptive language disorder. Sometimes I speak really fast as well, trying to sort of get through all the sort of like, the details that I want to sort of get through. So sometimes I do overshare or undershare, or basically sort of like, talk things from a different point of view, or just start things from a different sort of like point in the story rather than sort of telling the whole story.
It sounds like the challenges that you've experienced previously are in having the same social cues and having a lot of thoughts that you want to communicate quickly. And therefore there's a miscommunication between yourself and who you're trying to speak with.
Sometimes I don't read body language too well. So that's sort of like, it's kind of like sort of being mind blind because you can only sort of see like what's in front of you. You can't sort of see what they're actually thinking or they're sort of communicating in terms of what they're thinking.
Yeah, that makes sense. Knowing that, how have you gone about helping people to understand where you're coming from with those challenges? Like how do you get around those challenges on a daily basis?
Well, I do have a help quite a few people and stuff like that in my life. My wife has basically been very supportive. I also know that it is also hereditary, and also my daughter's been diagnosed with obviously she's autistic and ADHD as well. So, trying to sort of communicate with basically supportive people at her school. Also trying to sort of work with an occupational therapist, a speech pathologist, and also a clinical psychologist as well has been absolutely excellent with that. I've joined a couple of like networks and stuff like that. I'm now vice president of the Australian Neurodivergent Parents Association, which is basically sort of like a group of people that basically are exclusively neurodivergent. Also, I've connected with people on Instagram and Facebook and all that type of thing through the social media, which has been fantastic as well. I'm also the host of the Deep Dive podcast as well, which bring the positive aspects of neurodivergent and autistic and ADHD people, trying to sort of promote their sort of like, positives in their lives and asking them questions about their life and also sort of like, deep diving on what their sort of special interests and passions are. So that's been also sort of like, very cathartic for me as well. Also, I've joined a Neuro Access group, just basically sort of talking about sort of like, the accessibility issues in relation to systemic advocacy and also sort of like, talking about their challenge. There's also sort of some conventions and stuff like that, which they held online and stuff like that. One is Yellow Ladybugs, which is basically sort of a conference which is held online, and one in person. They're sort of really inspiring. There's a good chance for neurodivergent, autistic, and ADHD people to just get together and basically connect. Michael, you mentioned that you have challenges sometimes with your GP in the fact that they don't always understand where you're coming from. Can you help me to know more about what the challenges are with your GP understanding you? Firstly, I can't sort of like communicate my sort of like, issues in 10 minutes. Basically, I need to sort of get a longer appointment, up to 30 minutes, to actually sort of communicate my needs. Sometimes I need to get my support worker with me to actually sort of communicate my needs just in case I forget anything. I've got major health challenges like diabetes and sometimes, with stress levels and all that type of thing. Basically, the GPs are really like more or less gatekeepers and stuff like that. I've had to sort of work that sort of issues out myself, but I've been lucky enough to sort of do that. For a lot of people, sometimes that's inaccessible because of the lack of communication, like the lack of understanding between some of their sort of like, the people in the GP surgery in the first place. Also, if the GP leaves and then there's a new person, you got to sort of like, communicate all your issues again. And then sort of like, if they don't treat you well, you got to change the GP surgery, which I've changed quite a few times. Then you've got to sort of like explain the situation again. You got to explain all your issues, and then sort of like it gets stressful. So that's why I bring my support worker down, because knowing the sort of background and all that type of thing has been really helpful to sort of communicate my needs, especially when I'm stressed. What do you wish that more people were aware of about autism? I think being included and being sort of like, welcomed and liked is probably the biggest thing that we need at the moment. Would you also say it would be nice if people would not expect everybody to communicate the same way that they are and to be patient? There's no right or wrong answers in terms of like, communication and stuff like that. It's basically 1 in 4 people are autistic or they're ADHD now or have some sort of neurodivergence. Of course, definitely. So you've also got a daughter who has autism. How did you know, first of all, that your daughter had autism, and what does that mean for you as a father? It can be quite challenging at times because they can be a bit loud and bit sort of like, I'm very sensitive to noise. So I need to sort of wear my loop earplugs, or sort of like, sometimes I need to sort of escape to a room and stuff like that to re-regulate. Sometimes I feel a bit down and stuff like that because at the end of the day, when my kids go to bed, I just don't want to talk to anybody. They're good kids and stuff like that. The biggest thing that basically to get that support. There's not more support out there now compared to what there was before. when I was at school, basically there was no support. You had to sort of like, sit there and be sort of like, normal, sit up straight. I know there's quite a few schools that are more accepted and more inclusive of people with autism now, so which I think is really good. I've worked out strategies in the last few years to be able to sort of like, cope with fatherhood. So, I mean, communicating with my wife has been sort of helpful with that as well.
What do you find is the most beautiful thing or rewarding thing about being a dad?
Raising two really beautiful children and stuff like that, which is basically sort of like, we're trying to give them the best that we can. So I think we've done a good job so far.
Can you tell me about what it's like to be in the workplace with autism and how that has either enhanced or challenged your experience?
I'm currently not working. I'm kind of self-employed at the moment. So I found that sort of like it's taken back my control in terms of like, doing what I love doing. The main reason I've had to resign from my full-time job is basically because of the stresses that I was experiencing. I had a big autistic meltdown back in November 2023 due to changes in my workplace and stuff like that. They knew I had actually had autism and stuff like that because I actually explained it to them, and I got my employment through a disabilities employment agency. But the problem was basically sort of like, when the systems actually changed, and basically there was a lot of stuff that actually caused me to sort of like, perform the jobs 10 times slower, and it was basically 10 times harder than what it actually was originally because of my autism. I try and explain things a little bit differently, and then I ask questions and all that type of thing because we kind of got the perfectionistic tendencies. We want to make sure we get things 100% right. But the problem is basically sort of like some people just don't notice that. And basically, I'm trying to sort of get into workplaces at the moment. That's what I'm trying to sort of do in terms of my advocacy work. Trying to sort of like, get into workplaces and basically sort of train people. And this is how a person with autism works and all that type of thing. And trying to sort of work in some strategies.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds like would you say that you find it better in a workplace when your role is really clear and the expectations and targets are really clearly defined at the beginning, and
Yes.
that your manager or team are aware of the fact that, if there are going to be changes to that they need to be worked through in maybe a phased approach with you?
Like it needs to be done. And I think not a lot of employers actually do that.
In my corporate job, I'm working in a project space and things change all the time in that environment. And the people that work in the projects tend to be very comfortable with change. They come into a company to change the existing team members' roles, which is actually very challenging because usually they're not ready or they haven't had enough time communicated with them about what those changes are going to look like. When we come in and we're doing a project, my job is to look at how we're bringing the people and the customer to the front of everybody's mind in the way that we go about what we're doing. So that we're sitting down, we're doing the discussions and the research with the people that are affected, that we design the solution with them, and that we take them through how that solution is going to work together in a phased approach. So, yeah, it sounds really cool what you're doing in that space.
And I think because there's 1 in 4 people with neurodivergence, it's sort of like, helping to get those accommodations also in place as well, because a lot of autistics and ADHDers need that accommodation to be able to work well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's essential that the people that are responsible for leading teams and for, being in those senior roles in companies, it's essential that they're understanding their workplace. And as you say, if 1 in 4 people have neurodivergence, then that's 25% of your workforce that you need to ensure that you're communicating with correctly. Everybody learns in a different way. They might learn through hearing, they might learn through seeing, they might learn through doing. So any type of change should make sure that it addresses all of those different types of learning methods and
Yeah.
takes you along that journey properly.
I think sort of like, the biggest thing is basically sort of making the invisible visible and sort of like, trying to sort of for them to understand that. So I mean, sort of like sometimes we just don't get believed.
Mhm. What do you feel like you need to help somebody believe you? Like, do you need to have something from your GP or from your support worker? Is that what you felt like your manager needed to?
Yeah, sometimes you sort of you need to have that document to be able to sort of like communicate those issues.
First of all, I'm really sorry to hear that you had that experience in the workplace. And secondly, I'd like to hear what you did next after that. Like, how did you move forward?
I did apply for the disability support pension, but I got rejected for that, not because of medical reasons. I did actually got accepted for that, but the problem is basically my wife earned too much money at that particular stage.
How did you cope with that situation?
What I did was basically just try to sort of like build myself back up and stuff like that with resilience and stuff like that, and trying to get myself back up to a degree. I'm also sort of like connecting with other people as well through, basically the work that I do. Firstly, with the Deep Dive podcast, which I established in June last year, because I was seeing people on social media basically sort of like, building their own businesses and stuff like that from scratch.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It sounds like you turned a really challenging moment into something quite positive, like quite actions driven.
I try and sort of like, be as happy as I can because I like exactly who I am. So I think it's sort of that's the biggest thing. I'm really positive and stuff like that. And I like and I'm quirky and weird, and I like being quirky and weird.
We've got to have differences, don't we? We've got to have differences in order to make the world interesting.
It's a spice of life, really.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Do you feel that experience in the workplace was a defining moment for you? Did it change the course of your life?
It did because I sort of like I needed to have those meltdowns and stuff like that because I think there's a lot of change now compared to what there was before, and I think sort of like having that sort of like that change has really benefited me in a lot of ways. So I think sort of it's good to sort of like be really connected and stuff like that with other people, and also sort of like trying to sort of like inspire other people myself to actually sort of like inspire that change. So, I mean, it's still in a work in progress at the moment, but I'm really feeling like the momentum is starting to shift.
I really, really like that. I feel your energy is quite infectious, and the fact that you've taken something that, was significant and was really challenging and really stressful, and you've chosen to use that to do something better for yourself and to have a look at what you actually really want out of life and go for it and connect
Mhm.
with more people and bring, more energy to such a valuable cause. That's really inspiring. What advice would you give to other people who have autism and that is struggling to find acceptance or struggling in something in their life?
Just reach out and stuff like that, either to me or just, other people with autism. We tend to sort of like inspire one another, which I think sort of it's really sort of healthy. So if you sort of like inspire one person and stuff like that, another person to do a similar type of thing or sort of like, doing sort of something for themselves, I felt like I've helped somebody sort of live their best life.
Mm. I was going to ask you what makes you or what are you most proud of right now, but it sounds like that might be it.
I think so, yeah.
What's one thing that you want people to remember from this podcast or take away about autism?
Well, you're definitely not alone.
And
Just try and sort of like try and accept them and try and sort of get to know them because they could be an interesting person all around because we're definitely interesting people.
exactly. And maybe would you say just to, be a bit curious, let people be a bit curious, as you say, ask more questions.
Yes, ask more questions and just trying to find out what they really are and stuff like that because we don't tend to sort of like we tend to sort of wear a heart on our sleeve. We don't basically sort of like we basically say it how it is. We don't tend to sugarcoat it, and also we sort of like we don't hide things and stuff like that.
Mhm.
We basically just tell things how it is.
Yeah. And if somebody doesn't know, like, say in the workplace, somebody didn't know that their colleague had autism, how would you ask them to behave? Not the person with autism, the person without the autism.
Try and sort of be tolerant and just be kind. I think a lot of people need to be kinder in this society.
That's a great message to end on. Thank you so much.